Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are going to do a deep dive into 340 Weatherby Magnum. We're going to look at the history, we're going to look at performance, we are going to see how it compares to other 338s and its parent case, the 300 Weatherby, and we're going to find out why many have nicknamed this Thor's hammer. Hope you enjoy the video. The year was 1963. And a very popular cartridge was introduced. 1963, the very popular 300 Winchester Magnum came out. But there was another cartridge that was also introduced. Well, it doesn't have as much fanfare, that has a lot more recoil and performance. That is the year the 340 Weatherby was introduced. Now, the parent case to the 340 Weatherby Magnum is the very popular, successful 300 Winchester Magnum. So what Weatherby did was basically took the 300 Weatherby case, necked it up to 338, and called it the 340 Weatherby. Naming conventions have always been kind of hit and miss. I don't think there's any real guideline to how you name your cartridge. I think what Roy wanted was to make sure that people knew the 340 Weatherby was much more powerful than this 338 Win Mag, so I'm going to guess he just decided to call it a 340 just because of the extra power and to make it a little different than 338 Win Mag. So what is the performance difference from a 340 Weatherby and a 338 Winchester Magnum? You're looking at least 200 feet per second, sometimes 250, maybe 300 feet per second difference. So what you're looking at is shooting a 225 grain in the 340 Weatherby, kind of minimum at 3,000 feet per second. Now hand loaders, I know they've told me they get 3,100 feet per second. Out of a 338 Win Mag, I think tops you're seeing 28, maybe 2850. So again, 200 to maybe 300 feet per second faster. Looking at the data, there was one thing Hornady pointed out that I forgot to mention. When Roy created the 340 Weatherby in 1963, it immediately became the most powerful 338 cartridge. Now the 338 Lapua hasn't been introduced, and all the Wildcats, some of them were made, but in a factory rifle in 1963, this was the most powerful 338. Now let's look at Hornady's data. 200 grain at 3,200 feet per second, a 225 grain at 3,000. Like I said, I think bare minimum you should be able to get 3,000. And then a 250 grain, Hornady says 2,900. What I found interesting is Weatherby ammo. You can get a 250 grain going 2950, around there. So yeah, I definitely think you can get a bit more than 2,900. Now with me owning a 300 Weatherby, is there really a need for me to get a 340 Weatherby when the 300 in many instances is considered overkill? No, being completely honest, there was really no need for a 340 Weatherby. You can do everything you can in a 340 in a 300. The 340 Weatherby just gives you added insurance. So what kind of added insurance does a 338 give you over a 308? Let's just look at bullet size comparison. Both of these are common weights. I don't know if they're common bullets. On the left is a 338 250 grain. On the right is a 175 grain and 308. There's a huge difference. Now you can shoot up to 250 grain in a 30 caliber with a faster twist. Well, you can shoot up to 300 grain in a 338. Now I don't know if I can do it justice in this video to show you the difference in diameter. It is huge. You would think 30 caliber and 338 are kind of similar because you can shoot some bullets in the same weight. The diameter is much larger in the 338. In fact, 7mm is a lot closer to 30 caliber than 30 caliber is to 338. So not only are you shooting heavier bullets, but you've got a much larger hole going through the animal. So the bullets might have not shown the big difference, but let's look at the case mouth. Yeah, there's quite the difference between the 300 Weatherby on the left and the 340 Weatherby on the right. Let's go ahead now and look at the downrange performance of the 340 Weatherby Magnum with that 250 grain Barnes LRX, with a very good BC for a monolithic bullet of .602. Now muzzle velocity, 3,000 feet per second. Energy, almost 5,000 foot-pounds. And then the recoil is gnarly. We're going to get into why this cartridge isn't as popular as it should be. A lot of it has to do with recoil. it is a handful. Now, out to 400 yards, the bullet is definitely going fast enough to still expand, almost going 2,400 feet per second. And this is ballistics at sea level, so it's only going to get better as you go up in elevation. Almost 3,200 foot-pounds of energy. 23.4 inches of drop, which honestly is pretty similar to a 300 Win Mag. Pretty close. The Win Mag might be a little flatter. Out to 700 yards. This is where I would think the bullet's gonna maybe not open up as reliably as you'd want. I think you're pushing it 2,000 feet per second. That's where I would put my minimum. Energy still 2,200 foot-pounds at 700 yards. 101.9 inches of drop. It's not too shabby in that department either. Now I want to compare the 340 Weatherby to the 300 Weatherby and the 338 Win Mag. Let's start with the 300 Weatherby with a 190 grain LRX. Doesn't have the BC to match the 250 grain in 338, but it's kind of close, so that's what we're going to use. Muzzle velocity of 3,200 feet per second. I can confirm you can get that. I've gotten close to 33 with a 190 grain. 4,321 foot-pounds. As I've said, this thing is no slouch. At 400 yards, the bullet's going 2,507 feet per second, plenty enough to expand, 2,651 foot-pounds. And then the next two numbers, 4.9, that's 4.9 MOA adjustment for elevation. And in a 10 mile per hour wind, that is 2.0 MOA. 700 yards, bullets going 2,051 feet per second. I would say you are right in there with it still being able to expand, but you're kind of seeing its limits. 1,775 foot-pounds of energy. This thing's pretty good. And only 12.5 MOA adjustment at 700 yards. 338 Winchester Magnum. We are going to use the 250 grain LRX. I don't think this is the most optimal bullet for 338 Win Mag. My personal opinion, might be a hot take, is that it's a little too big and too heavy for a 338 Win Mag, but we're going to use it anyway. Muzzle velocity, I think this is really pushing it, 2750. You're almost 4,200 foot-pounds. You're getting pretty close to matching 300 Weatherby. 400 yards, bullet's going 2180, so it's still going fast enough to expand, and you have 2,638 foot-pounds. Then in drop, 6.9, so that's a 2 MOA disadvantage for 338 Win Mag versus 300 Weatherby. Not a huge difference in wind, 2.2 MOA. At 700 yards, bullets going a little over 1,800 feet per second. Your energy, 1,800 foot-pounds. Your drop, quite the difference between a 300 Weatherby, 17 MOA versus 12.5. And then 4.3 MOA in wind. 340 Weatherby with the 250 grain LRX. The 340 Weatherby, I think, is ideal for a 250 grain and bigger. It's got the oomph to move these bullets pretty fast. Muzzle velocity of 3,000 feet per second. Again, you're pushing almost 5,000 foot-pounds of energy at 400 yards. Bullets going almost 2,400 feet per second, and you're almost 3,200 foot-pounds at 400. That is almost a 600 foot-pound advantage over the 300 Weatherby. Drop, it's not as flat as a 300 Weatherby. It just won't be, but it's kind of close. 5.6 versus 4.9, and then the exact same wind drift. 700, again, I think you're on the very limits of whether this bullet will expand. It's probably the limit I would put it at is around 2,000 feet per second. Bullet energy, 2,214 foot-pounds, 13.9 MOA. Again, not as flat, but when you compare it to its 338 Win Mag, quite the advantage. 3.8 in wind adjustment, so it does beat the 300 Weatherby now because of that higher BC. Now let's talk about energy. I know a lot of people are poo-pooing on energy numbers, that it really just doesn't tell the story, and the most important thing is bullet placement. I 100% agree. Bullet placement is king. That's what's going to kill the animal. You know, shooting an elk in the foot with the 340 Weatherby isn't going to kill it, at least not very quickly. What I have to say is, yeah, shot placement is king, but if you can shoot a 340 Weatherby or a 338, whatever it is, just as well as any other cartridge you're going to shoot, why not have the extra insurance? Why not have the extra punch and the much wider bullet? So why does the 340 Weatherby have the nickname as Thor's hammer? Looking at the numbers and the performance, I can see why. Let's just compare it to the most popular bolt-action cartridge today, 6.5 Creedmoor. 6.5 Creedmoor, you're shooting a 140 grain bullet around 2,700 feet per second. 340 Weatherby, you're shooting a 250 grain bullet 300 feet per second faster than a 6.5 Creedmoor shooting a 140 grain. At 700 yards, the 340 Weatherby has the same amount of energy as a 6.5 Creedmoor out of the muzzle. The 340 Weatherby has over 1,000 more foot-pounds of energy than the most popular 30 caliber Magnum, the do-it-all 300 Winchester Magnum. 300 Win Mag has around 3,800 foot-pounds of energy. Again, 340 Weatherby, you're looking at 48 to almost 5,000 foot-pounds of energy. Lastly, let's compare the 340 Weatherby to the 338 standard, the 338 Lapua, which is this behemoth of a cartridge. The 338 Lapua actually has more case capacity and has more potential to be a bit quicker. However, thanks to the Weatherby freebore, well, you're getting really close in 340 Weatherby to matching a 338 Lapua. Now, I understand if you stoked both of these up, I do still think the 338 Lapua has about 50, maybe 100 feet per second advantage. But the 340 Weatherby, with its smaller case capacity, is right there with the 338 Lapua. In fact, the 340 Weatherby is an efficient Magnum.